Now, we'd like to think of international law having different layers. There's the traditional layer of coexistence, and then there's the layer of cooperation, and then there's perhaps the layer of solidarity. Uh, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, or even longer, I don't think the laws on coexistence are going to be sort of harmed in any way. I think they probably will survive even these times that we're undergoing, which is marked by populism, right-wing and left-wing populism, or neo-Westphalianism, or very strong sort of assertion of the sovereignty doctrine, both in its procedural and its substantive sort of senses. But I do worry about the international law of cooperation, and I do very much worry about the international law of solidarity. In the area of international cooperation, for example, we have seen that states are moving away from international treaties to political agreements. The EU-Turkey deal concerning the return of the Syrian asylum seekers or refugees is one of these unusual developments where we don't know if it's an agreement or it's a treaty or what will happen with it. This sort of ad hoc arrangements may be a lot more dominant in the coming 5 to 10 years. We don't know that. And in the area of solidarity, one area that would be likely to take a hit will be the international law of environment and the efforts of tackling climate change, because this has to happen collectively, and this sort of neo-Westphalian world may not be a very conducive sort of a political environment for collective action. So these sorts of issues, I think, would take a very serious hit, but states will continue to coexist and respect each other's diplomatic premises and flags, I'm assuming, in the high seas. I find this a very difficult question to answer because I think women have contributed to all areas of international law, and they've contributed both to the theory of international law, critical approaches to international law, as well as to the practice of international law. I don't think I can single out a particular field or a particular theory, and I would sort of say that this is the women's contribution to international law. But obviously there's one point maybe we have to recognize is that feminism and international law and the relationship between those two have been brought to the field mostly, if not exclusively, by women, which I think is quite disappointing, really, that we haven't had enough feminist male scholars in international law. Well, the joke about these positions in learned societies, the position of Secretary General is that it is more secretary than general. But leaving this joke aside, I'm absolutely honored to be the Secretary General of the European Society of International Law. One of my core duties is to oversee and organize and present the activities of the society to its membership. I obviously work very closely with all the board members of the society, and also function very actively in the Executive Council together with the vice presidents and the president of the society. But since I've been elected to this position, one of the core issues that I've been very sensitive about is gender balance and gender equality. And I think it's incredibly important that international law societies absolutely must avoid manels. And I think I don't need to explain what a manel is anymore, but this must be avoided at all costs. So this is something that I pay quite a lot of attention as the Secretary General when we plan our activities. There has been quite a lot of debate and discussion about what the role of learned societies are in progressing international law. The European Society of International Law is not engaged in progressive codification or progressive development as such, and some societies actually do that. I think a core aspect of the European Society of International Law is the diversity and the openness of its activities in all branches and areas of international law. It has a lot of interest also bringing in interdisciplinarity into the study of international law. But I think it's a very young society compared to some of the other societies, and we take pride in bringing young international lawyers into a larger community of international law scholars. So I see it as foremost a very open, very accessible and hopefully a gender balanced society that seeks to develop a wider group's diverse interests rather than a particular interest or an agenda. I do think of myself as a generalist of international law, but I do have a specialization in the field, like most scholars tend to do these days. And my area is international human rights law. So the challenges in my career have always been related to conveying or debating certain principles and their application in domestic law. So a particular recent challenge has been my interactions with judges, domestic judges, in relation to conveying the debate between counterterrorism and protection of freedom of expression. So this was a particular seminar that I held with judges in Turkey, and we were debating the relationship between counterterrorism legislation and freedom of expression. And I must say that those few days were one of the biggest challenges of my life, to actually convey how we could conceive this relationship and how international human rights law has developed some fine-grained standards that will not sacrifice freedom of expression against counterterrorism purposes. And it's a very difficult debate that requires a lot of trust and a lot of understanding of wide ranges of issues. I think that was the biggest challenge so far. I think I have a few good stories, but I'd like to maybe share one of my favorites. And this also has to do with a little bit of international law and a little bit of human rights law. I was invited to go to Serbia and Montenegro to meet a group of human rights lawyers and to do some seminars on the European Convention on Human Rights. This group of human rights lawyers from Belgrade, they said we should go to the seaside, we shouldn't be discussing these issues in our offices in downtown Belgrade. So we headed out to Montenegro for this seminar and stayed there for 5 or 6 days. And then we headed back. But when we headed back, Montenegro declared independence in the meantime. So there was 2 separate states, Serbia and Montenegro. And I had a single entry visa to Serbia at that time. So when I traveled back to Belgrade airport, they said, well, you don't have a visa, you can't enter Serbia because you're entering from a different country called Montenegro. And so I said, well, I don't think that there's an embassy of Serbia or a consulate, to be precise, to get this visa. And they said, well, this is not of our concern. If you're entering from this other foreign country, you can't be entering back, and we will be deporting you for this illegal sort of tribe entry. So at this point, I just turned around, turned behind me, and I said, I need a lawyer. And of course, right behind me were 15 incredibly accomplished human rights lawyers from Belgrade. So they immediately moved in front of the officer, and I didn't understand exactly what happened, but this very interesting international law dispute was resolved by the police officer looking at me, really tired of all the arguments that he's heard from all the Belgrade human rights lawyers, and he said, "Hayde, hayde," and that was the end of, I think, a very interesting international law situation at the time. Gender equality is an incredibly important principle of the European Society of International Law, and I think I don't think we're perfect at it because it's a point that constantly needs to be reminded. EASL has quite a lot of activities. There are lots of independent, interest groups in their activities. So in each and every of these activities, there has to be a champion, and it doesn't have to be a woman or an international lawyer. May as well be, and it ought to be also male international lawyers to remind that gender equality, gender balance in workshops and conferences is an incredibly important aspect of our work. But I think we take it very, very seriously and try to bring this perspective to all the activities that the society organizes. But I wouldn't say that this is something that we are always very successful at, because we need a lot of champions that need to remind constantly every member of the society of the importance of this issue. Now you could get me started. There there are quite a lot of headings, right, under this issue, and I wouldn't be the first academic. You don't have to be a legal academic to talk about these issues. But I'm also a consumer of research, in particular research that is done on difficulties that women face in academia. And there have been some very important sort of studies around this subject. And these sort of confirm our intuitions or our personal experiences. So what are these difficulties that have been very well documented as structural impediments in academia? Obviously, the first one is that female scholars get promoted a lot more slowly than male scholars because they are less aggressive in asking for promotions. So their career advancement may be a lot slower compared to a male academic. And they're also less encouraged maybe to go for early promotions. There's definitely the gap in pay between academics, and I think this is true also in academia between men and women academics in terms of the pay gap. There's been also new research that shows that women take on more committee roles or what we call service roles, and maybe take less time for their research because they are more cooperative than male colleagues, which means that they may have less publications because of their more cooperative sort of character. And of course, there's this other research on student evaluations that women always get evaluated less than men, even though they may be performing on an equal scale in terms of their teaching qualities. So a lot of gender stereotypes that are sort of systemic or structural really affect our day-to-day work. And I think the research that actually points out to this is a very important aspect which all the managers in high-level university administrations have to take into account. I think we know a lot more about impediments against women that is beyond our sort of personal, one-off experiences or intuitions. So to be aware of these things is, I think, a very important issue for all women academics. And I'm glad that there's a lot more research on it, robust research that we need to take into account. Yes, of course. I mean, this is obviously the question of quotas is a special and a temporary measure, right? I mean, this is how we debated also under the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women also has this sort of position. So wherever there is an underrepresentation of women, this is a serious concern that has to be taken into account, but in relation to also other types of underrepresentation. Because you might be a woman, but then there are different types of women. There's not just gender, but there's also ethnicity and religious background. It's a very complicated matter, but I would support that. But obviously, sometimes increasing the number of women in academia, we have to ask the question exactly at what position. Sometimes women can be very well represented at the entry-level kind of career positions, but not at the very high level. For example, heads of departments or professors or deans or rectors and things like that. So we have to think about where exactly we're trying to get these numbers of women at what level. Because if they don't have an influence on the decision-making processes, these women will be affected by these structural impediments that we have just discussed about, stereotyping and sort of the disadvantaged situation. So you may have a lot of women, but they may still be victims to the stereotypes and structural discrimination. So quotas and sort of the structural discrimination, they have to be sort of, I think, thought together. And this issue is a public policy issue that's not just affecting women. So hopefully men also will have to pay a lot more attention to these structural forms of discrimination. I was a very lucky graduate student when I started my academic career in international law. I had a lot of female, very strong, very incredibly accomplished intellectual women around me. So in the beginning of my career, actually, I didn't feel the structural problems and issues. And I might maybe link it later on to a few, any recommendations for women in international law as well, because having been around amazing female international lawyers, never made me think or question, whether we were in a sort of a difficult position in relation to this. So having female role models around a young graduate student, a female student, I think is incredibly important. So after I left my alma mater, which is the University of Essex, where I was surrounded by incredible female scholars, I must mention my professor, Frances Hampson, as a very important name for me in that regard. I know everyone has a person, and for me, she was a very important person in my academic development. Only when I got into my work, outside of this role model kind of framework, then I realized that there are lots of structural impediments. So in the beginning, I actually didn't see it as a very serious problem. So in my career, the experience was the other way around. So the more senior I got in the profession, the more I became aware of the difficulties of being a woman in the profession of international law. And I must say, we still have a serious manual problem. We have problems about women getting access to high-level grant and scholarships or funding applications. If you look at sort of the percentages of academics, male and female, who have access to these kinds of networks and so on. And obviously, the more senior the environment gets, the less women you would definitely see in international law. And this is the case in international courts and tribunals, as well as in academia. And the Gender Equality Campaign, obviously, the GECOL is trying to address that to some extent, but not very successfully so far. Maybe three, let's have three advices, right? So obviously the first one is an invitation to pursue international law. International law is worth, I think, pursuing, and it's getting, harder and harder maybe to imagine to pursue a career in international law. These are difficult times, so I'd like to invite every scholar who's thinking about international law to really warmly invite them to pursue a career in this field. The second one is maybe a more of a gender-neutral recommendation. And the gender-neutral recommendation is that if you want to be a scholar of international law, try to take risks, try to think outside of the box. If you have a lot of very, very strong literature suggesting certain ways of understandings, and a lot of men may have written those literature. I'm sure you will notice it soon enough. But try to remain critical of that literature regardless. So try to sort of find your own voice in seeking to understand and practice international law. I think, and this is a gender-neutral advice, obviously, but I think it's more important maybe for women because it may be harder to find one's voice in international law as a woman international lawyer. And the third is to seek other women international lawyers to join networks and to join relationships with others, and also to seek female and women role models of international law. I think it makes the world of a difference to seek the role models and to interact with them, and then maybe to kind of do the same later on in one's career for others. So those will be my three, I think, advices.